So this is episode 12 in my Chicago history series. For those of you guys who haven't seen the previous videos, I put those all in a playlist. We're going pretty much in chronological order here. Right now we're in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And as I've touched on in some previous videos, Chicago at this time was pretty much a patchwork of European immigrant ghettos. The vast majority of people here were European immigrants at this time. Chicago was only about 2% black. The Great Migration, which refers to the period when black folks started to migrate to Chicago from the south, well, really to the entire north from the south, that didn't start until about 1910, okay, and continued till about 1970. So the situation and the context is important to kind of set up here. So every European ethnic group at this time, pretty much, they had their own communities, and some of them had their own street gangs, okay, that I don't want to say protected these communities because they really didn't protect them. They preyed a lot of times on their own people, as I've touched on in previous videos. So it actually made it more dangerous for everybody. But I'll say, they had a presence in the streets in their own neighborhoods, and anybody else from any other neighborhoods or any other ethnic groups that wanted to come through, you were risking having a major problem, right? Now there was a lot of extortion going on. There was a lot of political corruption. And Chicago basically, was very divided along ethnic lines. So we're not talking about racial lines, but back then, the concept of race was different than it is today. Today is just like white, black, brown, it's like this color stuff. Back then, Europeans didn't all think of themselves as being the same race. You know what I'm saying? You had the Slavic race, the Germanic race, the Nordic race, then the Greco-Italian race. It was like Europeans kind of saw themselves as very different. And the languages from these European ethnic groups were spoken in their own communities. I believe I mentioned in a previous video that numbers-wise, the largest group in Chicago at this time, late 1800s, was the Germans. And the main predominant ethnic groups in the city, like the groups that had the biggest numbers, were Germans first, Irish, Italians, Lithuanians, and Polish. There was people from every country here pretty much, but those were the biggest, okay? A lot of Lithuanians for some reason. But in Ireland, a lot of people had been coming over because there was a lot of economic hardship, and a lot of immigration was coming over from Italy at this time. Now, I had mentioned in a previous video, though, that despite the fact that Germans had the most numbers, the Irish were able to get a lot more political power than them and were disproportionately able to get their people in positions of authority in the city government, because Germans had beef with a lot of other ethnic groups in the city, and there was a lot of anti-German sentiment, not only in Chicago, but really in the wider sphere of America at this time. Now, why was this? Well, for those of you guys who already studied this in school, you know that in Germany in the 1800s, there were a lot of political ideologies being born that threatened to really, stir things up in the United States, namely communism, okay? Frederick Engels, Karl Marx, they published their manifesto in London, and, but they were German, okay? So this is coming out of Germany, and the labor movement here was gaining steam. And in Chicago, we actually had an incident at Haymarket Square. I probably should have done a separate video on this, in which basically, this all came to a head, and a lot of anti-German sentiment started to grow because, we're talking about like among people who wanted to keep the status quo, because all these thinkers, trying to basically restructure America according to the vision of communism, and it had factory owners over here who were basically had their workers in sweatshop conditions. They were able to make their workers work these long hours, low wages, terrible conditions. The workers didn't really have any rights. But with this labor movement that was starting up, unions were forming, okay, and the union labor movement was a big force politically in Chicago, okay, and on the south side, where you had a lot of the factories, you had the stockyards, and you had this conflict between the factory owners and the business owners, and the labor unions and the workers. That was, like I said, creating pushback against the German community, plus a lot of things that were going on politically in Germany at the time, leading up to World War I, obviously. There was a lot of anti-German sentiment. The Irish didn't have all the ethnic beef that the Germans had, because their only conflict was with people of British descent. They did not get along with Anglo-Saxons. I know sometimes, like in this day and age, I've heard like in American, media discourse, like all white people are referred to as Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons actually only refers to people, of British descent. The Irish are not Anglo-Saxons, and they did not get along with them over here at all, especially at this time, because they've had their conflict with them going back decades. But that was their only beef. So if you were German, Polish, Lithuanian, Swedish, whatever else you were willing to vote for an Irish guy because your country didn't have beef with his. But all these other immigrant groups, they had beef with like multiple other countries. They were never able to get the same kind of political power that the Irish did. Plus, the Irish spoke English, okay? So, they also speak Gaelic, but English was, their main language, and so they had that advantage. Back in the day, it wasn't like today where you can just, get a language app on your smartphone and learn some new language. Back then, there wasn't even like TV or anything like that. You had to learn English, it was tough. The Irish already spoke English, so that gave them a huge advantage over these other groups. They start to dominate, okay? Now, like I said, there were ethnic gangs that kept things ethnically segregated in Chicago. In the late 1800s, there were two brothers born, James and Frank Reagan, okay? And they became like the leaders of what was, in the beginning, an athletic association, okay? Like a sports club, okay? And this is how a lot of these street gangs would start. And it only had, in the beginning, about 100 and something, like 160 members. But this would start to get involved, this athletic association would start to get involved in gang-like activities, okay? And they would start to, do a lot of the things that modern street gangs do. And their membership grew rapidly, okay? To before the first decade of the 20th century was up, they had grown to 3,000 members. And their motto was, at the time that they had hit 2,000 members, they had invented this motto, you hit me, you hit 2,000. So in other words, you mess with one of us, you're messing with 2,000 people, and, we're all going to get down on you. This is no one-on-one thing. We're a gang. And, like I said, their presence in the streets really started to grow. Now, their headquarters was down on 55th and Halsted. At this time, the south side of Chicago is all white, and the Irish, are a huge ethnic group on the south side. This athletic association eventually became known as the Reagan's Colts. The two leaders, James and Frank Reagan, were the co-founders of this. So the Reagan's Colts, they started to get a name in the streets. They started to gain a lot more power. And they at first were in conflict with the Italians. Now later, in the later decades of the 20th century, they would eventually actually click up with the Chicago outfit. It was like they made peace with the ops, so to speak, okay? If you can't beat them, join them, that old saying. But in the beginning, they were not getting along with them, okay? And, they were just by themselves, about 3,000 strong. And they had some hustles that you really don't see today in Chicago. One of them was that they would go to Chicago politicians and basically offer their services, okay? So back then, the Chicago politicians would go for this. They would say, okay, cool, do your thing. They would basically contract with these guys. And there was no social media. There wasn't even really the scope of the mainstream media that we have today to be able to expose any of this stuff. People might have known about it, but it was like, what can you do? So, if you were living in a neighborhood that was controlled by these guys and you don't vote the way they want you to vote, that's a problem. You don't want to do that. So it was in Chicago politicians' interests to sponsor these street gangs. And, the Reagan's Colts got a lot of politicians basically in their pocket by doing this. Another thing that they would do was that they would force news stands. And again, back in the day, the news hustle, as far as selling papers on the street and stuff like that, that was, a much bigger factor than it is today with, the change in media that's happened. But they would force newsstands to sell certain papers. Later, they started a news agency that published the results of racetrack betting and gambling. And this became the most dominant source of news for gambling results in the country, and it became a very lucrative thing, and it eventually led to a major life-threatening problem for James Reagan. But I'll get to that a little bit later. The Reagan's Colts start doing these hustles, right? And they're growing in numbers. Now, around 1910, like I said, in the first decade of the 20th century, when the Irish have, complete control over these neighborhoods, a new ethnic group starts to come to town. And I alluded to this earlier, and that's black folks coming up from the South. Now, you might ask, why would black folks want to come here with the way that I just described Chicago? I said Chicago is a network of these European immigrant ghettos. It's gang infested, it's crime infested, it's politically corrupt, it's dirty. Everyone's working in factories where it's like sweatshop labor. Like, who would want to come to this, right? Well, you got to remember, this is only like 35 years after slavery's done. And a lot of, the people who were coming up were former slaves, like people who had actually been slaves during their lifetime or their kids. So, I mean, I wish that there were more historical documents like, letters and diaries and stuff like that from the people who made the Great Migrations to know exactly like, what they were, what was going through their minds when they were coming up here, or what they thought they were going to find. But I mean, you can't really blame them for not wanting to hang around in the South. We take it for granted in this day and age that slavery didn't come back. So they come up here and they find this situation, though, that's totally different from what was going on in the South, right? In the South, there's no street gangs, you know what I'm saying? There's no European immigrants even really like down there. I mean, down there it was like, Anglo-Saxon whites, okay, that, had basically ran their communities. Up here, these are like white people from a different culture and who have like a totally different idea of how their community should be structured, with different rules, different politics, all this stuff. So they're coming up here trying to move into the South Side in the areas where the Irish live. Now, this conflict, okay, this like community ethnic change conflict is something that we deal with in America to the present day, and it goes all ways. I mean, when we just Google gentrification, you're going to see all of the, political drama that surrounds this issue. I mean, this is a very controversial, like hot button issue, because people form their ethnic communities, and people, a lot of ethnic groups, they like to live in a culturally homogenous community where they can be around other people of their ethnic group. When a new ethnic group starts to move in, they feel threatened, right? They feel like their community is going to lose its cultural integrity, like the community that they knew and loved and grew up in with, where they saw the street signs with all their, with their ethnic stores and all that kind of stuff. Like, all this is going to be gone and it's going to change, and this new ethnic group is going to take over. This is something that to the present day, America deals with all across the country in all cities. So the second thing was that, like I said, they were involved in the labor movement. The labor movement at this time was trying to negotiate better wages, an 8-hour workday. They were trying to negotiate better rights in the factories and better conditions for the workers that were, working in the industrial South Side. They were part of labor unions, and the labor unions were trying to get this done. One of the main tactics being that they would go on strike when the factory owners didn't meet their demands. Well, these black workers coming up from the South, they weren't part of these unions. So for the factory owners, it was a dream come true, because they were like, okay, fine. You want to go on strike and not work for this wage? We'll just bring these black folks in. They're willing to work for this wage. We don't need you. You can just take a hike and lose your job. You know what I'm saying? And we'll just hire them and get the same amount of money, get the same amount of profit for, paying them less. And they're happy to do, what you guys weren't willing to do. So the labor unions, okay, with the European immigrants, they're looking at this like, we got to stop them. So they were willing to do anything, including use violence, to stop them, okay? And this caused a lot of conflicts. So the black folks, when they first started to move in Chicago, started to move into an area that was known as the Black Belt, okay, along the South Side. I believe it was along State Street. I mean, now this area is like all black and Hispanic, okay? But like back then, it was like this strip along State Street. So the Irish gangs, okay, that were in the surrounding neighborhoods, hitting licks, robbing them. And if a black person was to come through their neighborhood, they would basically get down on them, okay? Now, they would also do this with other European immigrants, but it was like black folks weren't used to the rules here, you know what I'm saying? And plus, it was even more hostile towards them, because, if you're a Polish kid or something, you might be able to sneak through an Irish neighborhood and, not get noticed or whatever, right? Okay, well, if you're black, you're not going to be able to do that, right? You're going to stick out more. Plus, there was just a bigger threat because, like I said, their dads were factory owners and stuff like that, and their dads didn't want to lose their jobs, so that creates the hostility. Plus, they're thinking they're going to lose their community, so that creates the hostility. So it was just much more hostile towards black folks, okay, with the street gangs. Now, at first, this didn't involve like non-street gang members. It was mainly the gangs, okay, and the Reagan's Colts were one of the main gangs that was involved in this, basically like muscling black people and like being hostile towards them on the south side. Now, they eventually played a big role in the race riot of 1919. That is going to get its own separate video because that's a long story that has a lot of details in it that I need a separate video to do that. But just know for now, the Reagan's Colts played a big role in that. They were getting out on black people like all over the south side. People were, the Irish and the blacks were basically riding on each other all over the south side. By the time it was done, there were 24 black people that had been killed, and there were 17 Irish that had been killed. Okay, so that was a big race riot, man. Pretty much bigger than anything that we've seen since then, okay, in Chicago. Now, for the black community, having the Reagan's Colts and these other Irish gangs there was a two-edged sword because on the one hand, they were hostile towards their gangs and towards them. And there were a lot of gang wars going on in the streets at this time, like, because the blacks had formed their own gangs by this point and they were beefing with these Irish gangs. But it was a two-edged sword because the Irish gangs and just the Irish in general also beefed with, like I said, Anglo-Saxons, and in particular, the KKK, who at this time, obviously there was a really strong KKK presence in the United States at this time. It's not like today where, they basically almost died out. Back then, the KKK was a major force in America, and they were something, that probably like on black people's list of threats was like the top one. You know what I'm saying? And the Reagan's Colts and these other Irish gangs, they beefed with the KKK like publicly. And the main instigators of this was really the KKK because they, like I said, were like Anglo-Saxons in promoting their side of the beef against the Irish, and they were very anti-Catholic. They were against Catholicism. They were in favor of Protestant Christianity, and the Irish were Catholic. Okay, so they actually in one incident lynched a KKK member in effigy. Like, kept the Klan from ever gaining a real presence here. You know what I'm saying? Like any type of a strong presence here. They couldn't really come here because of the fact that the Irish gangs like ran the streets. Okay, and if they saw one of them, it was going to be on. So that, like I said, for the black community, it helped them by keeping the Klan out. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not saying that, they were glad to have the Reagan's Colts here or anything like that because of that, but still, it was like a cost-benefit type of situation. I mentioned to you that they had this news agency, okay, that published gambling results. After the race riot and all that stuff was over, and as the Italians changed their street presence from the Black Hand syndicates, that would basically just extort people, to the Chicago outfit, after they became what, eventually became the Chicago mob and continues to be what it is today, the Reagan's Colts eventually clicked up with them. Okay, they stopped going at it with them in the streets and they clicked up with them. Now, they had this news agency, though, that published these gambling results. The Chicago outfit wanted to get this from James Reagan, but he wasn't willing to go for it. Okay, he wanted to keep it for himself and just keep this racket. So the Chicago outfit tried to get their own news agency to compete with his. That was what they tried to do first, to publish gambling results. That flopped. It couldn't compete. The Reagan's Colts news agency, that it was called the National News Service, they had already monopolized the market, and the Italians couldn't push into it. So then they started to take it by force. Okay, and James Reagan knew that they were coming for him, and he felt the threat. So he actually went to a friend of his who had a connect with the FBI. And the FBI offered him protection in return for a lot of information that he had about his political connections. He gave them a bunch of juicy information about how organized crime in Chicago and street gangs and all that stuff extended to like the highest levels of the government. The FBI was glad to have the information, but then they withdrew their protection from him. And he was hit with a shotgun blast over on Pershing Road in Chicago after this happened. He survived it. He went to the hospital. In the hospital, he actually gave information about who had shot him. And then, mysteriously, he was administered a dose of mercury that killed him. By this time, the Reagan's Colts were pretty much defunct, like I said, but they, along with some of the other Irish gangs that started up around that time. And by the way, Mayor Daley, the eventual mayor, Richard J. Daley, he was not a member of the Reagan's Colts. He was a member of a different Irish gang. I'll get to that, when I talk about the race riots of 1919, and I might do a separate video on his gang. But they started I ain't gonna say started. They continued a legacy of political corruption in Chicago and a direct connection between politics and the streets that caused a lot of racial beef in the city, man, because Larry Hoover and a lot of the black gang members later on, they actually referred to the fact that the Irish politicians had gotten their start in the streets and they were trying to do the same thing. I mean, times have changed, and with the media now, that kind of stuff can't really go on without a huge public spectacle and the public eye all over it. But back then, man, it was a direct. I mean, you would see guys getting out to vote for politicians, gangs directly involved in politics and on politicians' payroll, and it was just very, very dirty, man. And Chicago was a very dirty place because of this, and it started it caused the streets to become something that would get everybody involved, including people that didn't want to be in the streets. So in other words, just the regular workers who are in these neighborhoods who, pay taxes and want to work a 9 to 5 and not do any of this gang stuff. Well, if the politicians are working with the gangs, okay, the politicians obviously have a big degree of control over your life. So you're indirectly involved, right? And plus, they're stirring up all this stuff between these other ethnic communities. That was the other big thing. They were the ones that were instigating the problem with the black community when they first came up here. So, if you're just a regular Irish dude, living over here, and these street gangs are over here stirring stuff up with them, the conflict didn't just involve the gangs. Once it popped off, it was ethnic group versus ethnic group, and any white person that walked through the black neighborhood, they were going to get down on you, and a black person that came through the Irish neighborhood, they were going to get down on you. Now, they tried at one point to even get other European ethnic groups to come in on the conflict, like the Italians. They actually burned an Italian guy's house to try to make him think that black people had done it so that the Italians would come in on their side of the war, but it didn't work. They had beef with the Irish. You know what I'm saying? Like I said, every ethnic group was, on their own in the streets, fighting amongst each other. And so it was a bad end to a bad story with them, man. But, it did eventually start Chicago off on a trajectory that made it, today, it is documented as the most corrupt city in the United States. And, we all suffer for that in some way, directly or indirectly. But today in 2021, between Irish and Italian, or between Irish and Polish, or Irish and black, there's really no conflict. And if you look at how it all started, they stopped gangbanging. You know what I'm saying? When they were gangbanging, the gangs were stirring all this stuff up. Now that they're not doing that anymore, it's you don't really see any of that, Irish versus black mobs brawling, or Irish versus Polish mobs brawling, or anything like that. That stuff is totally died down. And I would say it died down probably 40 years ago. Your boy, when you see a report, I'm out.